Today's class is Finding Your Pilgrim Ancestors, looking at the online resources. We are fortunate to have James Tanner present this subject. James is experienced and knowledgeable in research and methods and sources. We appreciate his willingness to share that experience with us and also his time that he has spent to prepare. We'll now turn the time over to James Tanner.
Okay, like this says, and at the time of year when we'd be thinking about this is Thanksgiving coming up in November of 2022. And we're going to be looking at finding your pilgrim ancestors and looking at the online sources. So we'll be primarily looking at records that are fairly readily available to anyone who wants to get on. And as we were discussing this briefly before we started the webinar, the story is interesting because my experience in genealogy began about 40 plus years ago. And one of the things I needed to do back then, long before there was an internet, long before there was any online sources or anything else, is I had to determine what kind of work had already been done in my family. In some cases, I had books, and so they were helpful. That means that somebody had written a book about my ancestors, and I had a lot of ancestors in books. The Tanner family was very well known. And one of the first things that I heard in the Tanner family was, oh, we're descendants from the Mayflower people. And I said, so my searching at the library, family history library in Salt Lake, began with the idea that I was going to see how I was related and if I was related to someone who was a Mayflower passenger. Well, the fast end of that story is that, yes, I found that was true. And of course, like many other people, I began the process of looking at the pedigrees that had been generated over the years. And I found a pedigree on one of my two Mayflower passengers, and I now have more than I can say I'm sort of related to. But I found the pedigrees that went back and back and back. In fact, one of the pedigrees went back into like 600 AD, and it was all these long lines. And I was tracing that back. And that process back then was to look for family group records in the family history library and try and match up the next person in the line. So we kind of worked back, and I was piling up huge pile of photocopies of these pedigrees and of the family group records that went along with the pedigrees, and analyzing those as I went back. And I remember definitely that day that I got back on those, and that I'd been going back, and I suddenly sat there and said, this is bogus. I don't believe one word I'm looking at right now. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go clear back to the Mayflower people, and they're Francis Cook and Richard Warren are my two direct line ancestors. Actually, Richard Warren's son married Francis Cook's daughter. So they're basically both my direct line ancestors. So here's the situation. As I began searching in books that were and records that were more specific to the Mayflower people, I soon discovered a little book that was about a quarter of inch thick, probably around 100 or so pages. And basically I opened that up, and it said, there are no provable pedigrees for any of the Mayflower passengers except the following. And there were about 5 names. There's 5 or half a dozen names. And so that started the process. And over the years, it's been clearly made known to me that very, very few of the surviving Mayflower people, the ones that actually survived the first year, had an ancestry. And no one, and probably hundreds of thousands of hours of research, and probably in the realm of millions of dollars have been spent in researching these Mayflower people. And almost all of them have no pedigree to Europe. No one has been able to determine accurately who their parents are. Occasionally their wives who came later, or some of the other people will be, and the people who, and even of the women who came, there's a very few, but you need to be extremely careful when you go back, clicking back, and you find a Mayflower person And then you assume that what's in the family search family tree or any other pedigree is correct if it shows parents. You need to verify that, absolutely. That's the first thing. I guess that's my introduction to it, and that was one of the first things that I learned. And focusing on them over the years, I basically have it's still true. I mean, after 40 years later, more or less, it's still true. There's still no research that has ever cracked through. The easiest thing to understand is that they came out of England under duress. They were persecuted and essentially forced out. And it's assumed that most of them changed their names in order to avoid having their relatives and people, their parents and their relatives, being further persecuted. So that was sort of the situation. The Puritans, by the way, were English Protestants in the 16th and 17th century. I see a note here about it being life in the industrial heartland. Well, this is long before there was any real industrial heartland of England. It was most of the almost all of the passengers who came on the Mayflower, except for some of the younger ones, the children, were born in the 1500s. It's 1620 is when they reached England, in Massachusetts. So they were, most of them, over 20 years of age, and obviously had been born in the 1500s. And believe me, there wasn't a lot of industry in England in the 1500s, not like it is or was in the 1800s. Okay, so they were during the reign King James I, and the reign during at that time, he wanted to purify, and they were trying to purify the church of Roman Catholic practices. And their position was that the church hadn't been fully reformed, and it needed to be more Protestant. And so they were not popular, and they were persecuted, thrown in jail, and a lot of other things happened to them. Now, the name Pilgrim is a name that was given to them, sort of a nickname here in the United States, mostly because they're both the names, Puritan and Pilgrims, are essentially the same as referring to these people. And they first moved to the Netherlands. They were driven out of England and they moved over to the Netherlands, and they lived there for about 11 years. And the problem was that their children were becoming Dutch. They were learning Dutch. They were going to go ahead and they were intermarrying. And in fact, my direct line ancestor Francis Cook married a Walloon, a lady who was from the southern part of the Netherlands and near Belgium. And when they left, they were planning on settling in what was called Northern Virginia, and that was led to some very difficult circumstances for them, because basically they ended up in Massachusetts and they weren't in the right place. They were off by maybe a few hundred. And they also was the fact that if you've been to Virginia and you've been to Massachusetts, you know that the weather in Massachusetts is not exactly the same, and the place in Massachusetts is a lot rockier and a lot less hospitable than a lot of places in Virginia. So they could have, it was basically almost total ignorance of the geography of the American continent. They just really had no idea where they were going and didn't know where they were when they got there. And that caused a problem because they were sort of illegally on property that they shouldn't have been on, because they didn't have any kind of a grant of land from those who technically, under the grants from the king, owned that part of Massachusetts. And so it took them more than a year to send boats back and forth and then finally get it resolved that they could live where they had ended up in the Massachusetts Bay area. So they came to North America on the Mayflower in a ship, And they established Plymouth Colony, and it's in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's the same place. And it's named after the port they finally left from in England, is Plymouth, Devon, England. And that's where why they called it. And it's and you will find most of the names of the towns in Massachusetts have their counterparts in England. So they were also known as separatists, and that was what they were called, because when they arrived here, the name of the religious persuasion that they had became known as congregationalists. And there are still a large number of congregational churches in the eastern part of the United States primarily, but there are congregationalist churches all over the world. And it is still a very small sect of people, and it is, but it is still in existence. And they were, in a sense, seeking religious freedom, but it was more for religious freedom to actually live and not be persecuted. So that was the concept there. And what they had to do is, and as we'll talk a little bit further, it's what you've got there is a picture of them signing what was called the Mayflower Compact. The reason for the compact was that there were other people who had come along on the trip at the time who had nothing to do with the church and or the religion, and were merely there because they were looking for land, and they were actually land speculators. So, and there was also the crew of the ship, and they ended up having to live there for a while. And so they wanted to make sure that people were living the religion instead of having a bunch of people who didn't believe. So they had them all sign this Mayflower Compact. And it's important to understand that the Mayflower arrived in Massachusetts Bay in November of 1620. And if you want to look on your iPad or your phone or your computer and look up what the weather is like right now in Plymouth, Massachusetts, you might decide that this wasn't the greatest time of the year to land. And the first and biggest problem, of course, was that they had to be fed and there was no place to live. And so they actually lived on the ship for that first whole winter, beginning November until the spring, when they could get out of the ship and onshore when it wasn't snowing and wet and cold, and could build someplace to live. And they had 102 passengers, and those included the Puritans, the sailors, and the land speculators. So they're all together, there were 102 of them. And after that winter, only 53 passengers and half the crew survived. So the first winter in America was terrible. It was a disaster because almost half of the people had died. And the women, there were only 19 women who came on this trip, on the first trip, and only 5 of those women survived the winter. And because of their being confined on the ship, you can imagine living on a ship as small as the Mayflower with about 100 people, and as they were dying off, having to either to bury them or whatever. And this is a picture of the Pilgrim Cemetery, the part of the Pilgrim Cemetery. And here's the list. This is the entire list of the survivors who lived to have descendants. So after that first year, some of the people who lived through the first year did not have any descendants. And so were a few more people who show up on extensive lists, and the lists. So you don't want to mistake the list of the 102 people with the list of the survivors, because the descendants obviously only came from the survivors. And these are the tough people that had great immune systems and managed to survive that first year living in the close quarters of the ship. Once they realized the problems they were in with where they were, the ship returned to England, and leaving them stranded. But other supply ships began coming, and more people came to settle. And not all of them were dedicated Congregationalists or dedicated Puritans, but they were, and that began to create splinter groups and all of the development of that part of the world in Massachusetts. So this is an interesting, and it's a very dramatic story, and there's quite a bit written about it. And it's estimated now that there are about 35 million Mayflower descendants in the world. So there's a fairly large number of people that have, as a pool, can trace their ancestry directly back to those 53 surviving people on the Mayflower. Understanding also that some of them, if you look at the list and carefully and think about it, most of those people were men. There were only five women survived. The rest of the 53 people that survived were men. And so they had to wait till their wives came, or people came, and they were able to get married to have descendants. So that it was over a few years process. And a lot of the people came in 61, 62, 63, and so forth. Maybe 21, 22, and 23, and on for a number of years. So where are the records? Where do we go to get the records? And the first thing that you should become very good, if you're even at all interested in New England genealogy, you should be involved with and have a membership with the New England Historic Genealogical Society. This is the source of the vastly largest source of direct information and original documents about anything having to do with Massachusetts history, but it's primarily New England. And there's some places they have a lot more about Massachusetts and coincidentally about New York, but which is not a New England state, and not so much about Rhode Island, for example, and more about Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, which was part of Massachusetts. And so there's just a lot of different, there's a lot of places where they have the tremendously helpful documents about the people who came, these people who came to America and established the New England states. So it's called NEHGS. That's how they refer to it. And it's the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And their website is called AmericanAncestors.org. So it's all one word, AmericanAncestors.org. And it is a tremendously helpful website. Now, there are other websites that have focused primarily on the pilgrims and on the passengers. And so here's the full passenger list. This is the original list of passengers. And it's on a website called Caleb Johnson's MayflowerHistory.com. And I've got it's just Mayflower history all run together .com. And it is very helpful because it has not only all of the compiled lists, but it has an archive of transcribed primary source records of all about the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims. So if you go to the website, you can find all of this original information and all of the transcriptions of it. So you don't have to go back and try to read the handwriting or anything. They've all been transcribed. And so it's very helpful. And it's a very a good way to get started in understanding. Now, if you are so fortunate and you feel like you're fortunate enough to prove that you are related to direct line related, not by somebody's cousin or whatever, but a direct line descendant of the Mayflower passengers, then you are able to join the Mayflowers, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, which is the full name of the society that we call the Mayflower Society. And the Mayflower Society is a descendancy group, and you have to go through their process of proving that your ancestry connects to the Mayflower. And there's some simple ways and shortcuts on this that I'm going to talk about here that make this a little bit easier than you might think, and in some cases a lot harder than you might think, because you're not ever, I'll explain that in a little minute here. And so this is what you have to do. You have to be able to prove a direct lineal descent from a passenger aboard the Mayflower who stayed on to establish the colony. It's not fair becoming a descendant of one of the ones that went on to England or went back, like the people who went back to England when the boat went back with the sailors and the crew. So it doesn't help. It's limited to that descendancy list that is the ones of the people who they consider to be the true Mayflower passenger people. So it's kind of like if you're familiar with Utah, it's like becoming a member of, well, it used to be, because now they accept anyone who's interested in the history, but the sons of the Utah pioneers and the daughters of Utah pioneers, they're not so stringent anymore in proving that you actually came descendant from a pioneer who arrived in the Utah Valley from 1847 up to 1867, 64, in that range, depending. Okay, so here we are with the possibility of getting, and this, by the way, is a digital copy of the Mayflower Compact that was signed in 1620. Now, this is what they mean by a straight lineal accent of descent. If you do how am I related on sorry, didn't want to do that. If you do how am I related on Family Search, you will basically see a straight line. That's a lineal descendant. That doesn't, if there's a crook and you go over, or it's a marriage or whatever, then you're not descendant from that person. So in my case, and we were having a little discussion about this, it's 13 generations. And I would, and from my standpoint, that means it's 14 for my children and 15 for my grandchildren and 16 for my great-grandchildren. And if you're starting out now from zero, you probably have to go back and verify every single step, because you're going to need to prove your actual lineage back, every single person back, every parent. There must be their acceptable documents for every parent-child relationship. So that's what you have to do. But there's, as I'm going to tell in just a second, there's some shortcuts. So here's the resources. These books are called the silver books for kind of obvious reasons, because they have a silver cover. And there are 1 or 2 volumes on every single one of the passengers. Okay, so the Mayflower Society has long been researching these people, exhaustively researching every one of them. And they published this book, and they have published it for some time, and they, and you would think, well, they're going to update it. No, they only get updated. I mean, it's like a major event and major news among the Mayflower people if anything is added to or changed in these books. The research here has been, in the term that's often used in that context, is exhaustive research, and this is as exhaustive research that can be found. If you want to know what solid gold research looks like, you go look at these books. Now, these books are available in libraries. If you go on to worldcat.org, WRLDCAT.org, and look for the Mayflower families through 5 generations, they can tell you if there's a library near you that has these copies. The volumes themselves are available for sale from the Mayflower Society, and they are pricey. You're talking $50 to $80 a volume for each of these books. But this is it. This is it. And understand this, every single possible person that is related to these people has been extensively documented through 5 generations. And so if you, the shortcut here is that if you connect to one of the people that's in one of these books that has been proven on the 5 generations, then that's basically you're home free. Because if you're related to this, to one of the 5 generations down from Francis Cook, for example, then you will automatically have access to the Mayflower Society, because that's all you have to do. Now, there's another step. If one of your relatives has gone through the process of doing this and they have accepted that, then one of your other next generation down, 6th generation or 7th generation people may possibly already be certified. They may have what's called a Mayflower number, and they would have a registered number. And if you can connect to that person, then you are home free. So it's not as, it's either much harder than you can possibly imagine, or it's a lot easier than you probably were imagining that you had to do. And so that's how you do it. And there are other things about this, by the way, that are considerably. So this is the 5 generations. Okay, this is looking back at my one of my ancestors on the Mayflower, and so you can see that his John Cook married Sarah Warren, and that's really where all this comes down. And then Mary Cook, and then Esther Tabor, and Esther Brownell, and William Teft. And in each case, there has been tremendously documented specific documents that show that each of these people existed, and that's their relationship. So don't go to and I'm going to say this more than once, don't go second guessing this. Don't think there's, because you find a pedigree, or you find somebody's research, or you find it on Family Search, that somehow or another there's another person in here, there's another child, there's another marriage, there's something else that happened here. The answer is no, it's not going to exist. And they have all the records. They have gone through every possible record that has ever been created or found to date. And like I said, if there's anything that comes up, it's major news. And people are more specifically focusing on their parents than they are on their descendants anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that on the Family Search family tree that there aren't changes going on with this family, and I call these Francis Cook and Richard Warren, and then the people related to them down about the first 2 or 3 generations, as revolving door ancestors. On any given week, people will make changes to Francis Cook's genealogy, usually running around 100 changes a week to these people, just to 2 or 3 of these people's sites on Family Search. So any given day, it may not be at all correct. And so I would suggest, before you even get started, don't even look at Family Search so much if you really want to go back, is start with the books. And I'll tell you where the rest of the information is, because there's even more. And then you can begin understanding where your ancestors came from. So now, as I mentioned, the silver books are available from any HGS or the New England Historic Genealogy Society, but they're also available online, digitized and searchable. Now, this isn't complete. They haven't done the complete digitizing of all of the volumes of the silver books yet, but that's in process. And if you have, it's cheaper to have a subscription to American Ancestors than it is to buy the books, believe me. And so here, if you get a subscription to American Ancestors, then you will be able to get access to the books and the information that's there by searching for it. Now, it could be that the line you come through hasn't been digitized yet, so you may still have to go to the books. So we'll get to that. The other part of this is that some of us can, if you remember, and if you think about it, you may have heard that in the past there was a situation where Family Search, American Ancestors was a Family Search partner. Well, the Family Search partnership that was or still may be available was did not include these records. So most of the records on the website, as a matter of fact, were not part of that partnership. And those of us who realized that after a period of time have just gone ahead and paid for membership in the NEHGS so that we can get access to all the records and all the other records that NEHGS has, which were far in excess of what was available as a Family Search partner. Okay, so here's American Ancestors, the website. It is a fairly complex website. It's kind of grown up in parts. So there's different parts of the website that are helpful and interesting and may be part of your research. Now, it goes without saying that if you are if you have ancestry that goes to New England, so some of your ancestors start to go back to New England, then there's always the thought, well, maybe they're descendants of Mayflower. Well, that's very possible, because as it goes back, these people intermarried, and there's at the end of 5 generations down, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of surnames that are associated with the Mayflower Society, with the Mayflower people. But this website is very helpful in getting into and understanding a lot of the records that are going on in that part of the country. And okay, so there are understanding that it continued on, and the big bulk of the people came to America between 1629 and 1640. And so what has happened there is that under Robert Charles Anderson and the New England Historic Genealogical Society, they basically began the research process of documenting every single person who came to New England between 1620 and 1633. And that volumes of those books are still going, because they're starting to extend that beyond 1633. And the goal is to go to 1640 and beyond. But let's just comprehend this. Every record about every person who came to New England has been documented. Think about it. When you get your research, when you connect back to these people that are in this book, you are not going to find anything more, and not going to be add much more at all, if anything, unless you want to spend the time to acquire the credentials necessary to even begin doing all that research. You would have had to have spent most of your life like Robert Anderson in the libraries in New England and the archives and all of the records that are available. Now, he's not the only one. There was a whole team of people that were spent who collated this idea. So understanding this, understanding that that as far as the ancestry of these early people is concerned, they all are all in these books. Now, if they don't know where they came from and they don't know who their ancestors are, it's because they basically did not know, the records did not have that information. And so it's not a situation that's like, it's not like, you know, oh, wow, I can get in there and look, see, do some of my own research. No, this is the kind of thing where you need to understand that the work has been done. And as far as it's concerned, this is as much information as you're going to find, even if you went and sat in the libraries. The whole thing is called, it's been going since 1988, and the whole thing is called the Great Migration Study Project. And the goal, like I mentioned here, is to go to 1640. Well, by the time of 1630, when they did the first set, there are an enormously larger number of people coming from England to America, and between those next years. So it's a much greater task to do the next few years than it was to do the original one, because that's when all the people started pouring into New England. So understanding these basics databases are available, printed out and available, and they are usually they're available in larger libraries. Now, unlikely that you'll find these books in your local public library. That's possible if there was somebody who had an interest and ordered them in, but they're very expensive books from the standpoint of having one book, as I mentioned. But on the other hand, they are available in a lot of the university libraries, and obviously the further east you get, the more possibility is that they've gotten a set of the silver books or the Great Migration series. Both those books, and the Great Migration books and the silver books, are available in the BYU Family History Library. Now, if we go to another place, now this is something you may probably be familiar with, and perhaps you didn't realize this. This is the FamilySearch.org genealogies. If you go on this under the search tab on Family Search, you'll see records, images, family trees, genealogies, catalog books, and wiki. Maybe you have never even looked at the genealogies. Maybe you clicked on it and you said, well, I don't understand what this is, so I don't think I'll have anything to do with it. Well, basically what it is individual sets of records that have been accumulated, not just a few, hundreds of thousands of millions of records in here. And they are different than the records that we talk about. These are records that have been compiled records. And what they have done in a lot of cases is compile records that are just simply people's genealogy research. But they have separated them out into those records which are reliable and less reliable. And in fact, if you look do a little bit of research and to learn about the Family Search genealogies, you'll find where they're kind of ranked. And pedigree resource file and the ancestral file, for example, are ranked as unreliable. And you get into and it says right here on the top of each one of these, this says high data accuracy. And then it says mostly accurate. And then it'll say unreliable. So it tells you right there that part of these are worth looking at as far as finding additional information about your family. The others may be helpful, but not reliable. And the one that's reliable is called community trees. And the reason why it's reliable is because a great deal of time and effort and expense was made in documenting. And community trees has takes a specific group of people, usually in a small town or in a parish or whatever, and does the exhaustive search of extracting and putting into pedigrees and family group records every single person who lived in that town. Now, for places, where are these? They're in Norway primarily, actually. There's quite a large number of them in Norway and others scattered around the world. And for a long time, this was a project under Family Search and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But it was discontinued a few years ago. I can remember when my friend, who was one of the main people in the Community Trees Project, came to me and said, well, they've done away with this. We're not going to be doing this anymore. And I thought this was a tremendous loss to the genealogical community. But fortunately, this information that was gathered has been preserved here. Now, what does this have to do with the Pilgrims? It has to do with the fact that one of the genealogies that was taken from the silver books. Now, this information here is not different than, it is basically the silver books. And all the information from the silver books is available here on Family Search for free. All you have to do is get in there and start looking for it. And it has the descendants, and it has a single represented for each pilgrim and their descendants for the time period of the late 1500s to 1910. These lineages descend from the 26 couples that survived the first winter. It's the 53 people. And their descendants can be found all over across the United States. And there are 572,821 people in this record. So here it is, and it's free, and it's available, and you can get in here. And there's don't equivocate with this. Don't say it's somebody's opinion. Don't say that this is what is, that, oh, well, my grandmother said this and that was all wrong. And no, this is the same thing as the silver books, because it's the source is the 30-volume publication of the Mayflower families through 5 generations. So this is where this comes from. So this is where it is. It's on Family Search for free. Now, you have to learn how to get into this. It's not going to be like, oh, we can find everybody immediately. It's and the only way you're going to find it on communities is to do keyword search for Mayflower and the community trees. And then it'll come up, but then you'll have to get into this particular database and start working with it. And it takes a little while to understand how it works. So this is that one section that I just referred to that tells you that this is the 30-volume publication of the Mayflower families through 5 generations. Now, the information has been essentially extracted from this, but the information is still here. So think carefully about this and realize that because of the studies that have been ongoing for years, all of the people who came to America before 1640 have been researched and identified as far as possible. Now, if you conclude, now America is a little more expansive, because by 1640 people were coming to other parts of the America, but this is focusing on New England, and it's the original New England colonies, and not into Virginia and North Carolina, and whenever they started showing up, even before that. So, but I would mention this, that, for example, in Georgia, there are studies that were done of the descendants of James Oglethorpe and his group who came into Georgia as the original settlers, and all of those people have been identified and their descendants. So when you get back into these first level of people who were the original immigrants, in a sense, those original immigrants have been exhaustively researched. Now, what happens with some of them is the most obvious thing of all, because once you get away from the Mayflower people, their connection back to England comes through the Netherlands, and basically until other people arrived, it's not going to be possible to find their ancestors for most of them. But once the other people started coming, of course, there's going to be documentation for some and not for all. And it is not unusual to get to a New England or an immigrant onto the eastern coast of the United States during the colonial period that simply appears here without any connection or any possible way of determining who that person was and where they came from, other than they may have spoken English and came from England or Scotland or Ireland or Wales. But that's just the kind of the reality is that this is the time when the early immigrants came, let's say during the 1600s, was the time when many of these people came because they were escaping what they want their lives in Europe, in England and Great Britain, and they did not want to be recognized, and they changed their names. And some of them had to because they were indentured servants or they were transported here. They were criminals. So from all those purposes, we understand that it's sometimes not possible to find the origin of an ancestor despite all the work that you want to do. So when you connect to one of these people, when I speak of these people, the puzzle is full. There are no blank spaces. Any of the information that's available is already available as far back as the records are available. So don't try to second guess, don't try to change, don't go into family search and say, oh, my grandmother has a different child in this family, and so I'm going to change the family, because that isn't the reality. The reality is that this is one area of the world when there's been a concentrated effort to determine who these people were and where they came from. Okay, so that's kind of the background and the reality of this. So I guess my admonition here is don't rely on someone's old genealogy record sheets, books, or GEDCOM files. It's not a good idea, because basically you need to go to the sources. You need to look and see if you match up with these people, if you match up to one of the descendants, and then you're just simply home free. And then it's basic. Whatever's there in the family search family tree, although it's in matter of flux because of the changes being made by people constantly, is basically not controversial, and the changes are frivolous and unfounded. And so it's very frustrating, though, to have that be the reality of what's going on. Okay, so here's the start. You may have a family tradition. In other words, you may have something that says you came from these people. You may have a surname in common with one of the passengers, and this is probably the weakest possible connection. And you may hope you are related, which is something that I run into not infrequently. But first, you need to have ancestors that ultimately came from Massachusetts in the 1600s. So somehow or another, you have to make sure that you get yourself back to that point. And if you can't get yourself back to 1600s in Massachusetts to start with, or one of these people in the 5-generation or certification list, then it's very likely that you are not related to one of them. You may be related to an ancestor who came very early into New England, and that may be one of the people in the Great Migration books. But other than that, you may or may not be related to the people who were on the Mayflower to come in 1620 in November in the cold. Okay, so you need to look into the existing records before you make changes to family search, family tree, or any other family tree. It's very, very important that you understand what you're doing when you get into working back. And I would just kind of make a rule that anything before 1700s is very likely, is not necessarily correct, and that's not what I'm trying to say, but it's very likely have been based on information that is in the existing records. And so you need to become familiar with the sources and realize the limitations and the problems. And when I'm frequently doing research into the 17 and 1600s, I realize how difficult it really is. It's really difficult to start to separate people with the same name when you have 5 people born with exactly the same name in the same area at the same time, and the records just don't tell you who the parents were. So it's kind of a guess at that point. So those are the kinds of situations that you will find. And those are called end of lines, meaning you've reached the end of your line. It's not a question of a brick wall. It's not just that you have to find more records or find more research until there's actually more records, or you spend your time to go to records that are not easily available and are still in existence, is when you would start to make some progress. And one of the great sources here is that immediately upon coming to America, the people began to keep town records. And these are records that go well back into the 1600s. So for instance, here's Barnstable, Massachusetts, and from 1640 to 1855. And everything went into the town records. They were real estate transactions, marriages, deaths, burials, births, taxes, disputes, road making, anything that was going on in the town was recorded to some extent by these people. So reading the town records is like reading a week by week or day by day almost history of each of the towns in Massachusetts and other parts of New England where the records exist. And so once you get back into this type of situation, your job begins to sit down, like I have done for weeks at a time, and sit there and read through every page of the whole history, starting when the history starts. And then you're basically looking for any mention of your ancestors. They may be people who were very obscure, and you may find 1 or 2 mentions, or they may be people who are very prominent in the community and involved in the governing parts of the community, and they come up on every page. So your problem is going to be to go through that and make some sense out of all of the information that's contained in these town records. So, and they're generally available, and they have been collected for many years from Family Search. And so you can just go down and look at them. They're very hard to read in some cases, but they are the source for the information in these, from getting back into these families. Here's an idea. Here's a example of a town record, how they wrote it in. And this was one that I chose, which is extremely well written, meaning the handwriting is extremely legible and well written. And this is 1651 and 1666. Now, this may be a copy of the original town record, because they would sit down and make a hand copy of the record occasionally. So the fact that it appears all in one handwriting is a sign of a giveaway that this might be a copy, but it is the original record. And yes, you have to search page by page. That's until artificial intelligence reads all these documents and they have word for word indexes, but that will probably happen. It's in the process of happening right now. Okay, so follow these 5 rules. And these are based on a book called Genealogical Research, a Jurisdictional Approach, published back in 1972 by a couple of people, including my friend Arlene Ekel. And these are the things. Start with an open mind. Work back in time systematically. In other words, don't go into this thinking you already know you're related to this person, to these people. Go in there with an open mind. You may or may not be. Work back in time systematically. Don't jump back. Just refrain from doing that. It doesn't matter to me if your genealogy looks like it goes back 50 generations. I would start with you, and I would start back systematically. If you are satisfied systematically as you read all the sources and everything having to do with each person going back on your line, then you can have some confidence in what you're doing. Use original source records. Don't rely on people's books that were written many years later or people's compiled genealogies. Make sure you do your own verification. Carefully document your sources of information. If you're going to move back and the work has not been done and you haven't found that, then make sure you document everything that you do in detail. And then analyze your results for accuracy and completeness. And don't be overwhelmed with the sources. I'm just going to click down. Here's the references to Robert Anderson and the New England Historic Genealogical Society handbooks on New England historical and all of the information where this is coming from. And you'll probably never get through the sources because groups of people like this that have been organized for years are still working their way through all the sources, and a lot of information is coming out, more information about all these people. Thanks for watching.